Oh, the tea is hot today. Welcome to the Jaybefaunt channel. I'm your host, James Fauntleroy. So good to see all of you here on this Tuesday afternoon, as always. Just to let you guys know that the Jaybefaunt channel is also part of the Revolutionary Blackout Network. So you can find me there on Thursdays for the Savvy and JB show and Sundays for the JB show. So good to have you all back, everyone. Nice to have you. So if you guys have not already, go ahead and give a like to the stream. This helps me out to be able to reach more people. So I appreciate that there. Also, if you have not already, you guys can actually go to my Substack if you want to get the email notifications whenever I go live, upload clips, or write any articles. That's at jaybefaunt.substack.com. Also, if you guys want to ask me any questions, you guys can go to QBounty. You guys can actually get video responses to these questions that you guys may have. You guys can go to qbounty.com/JBFaunt there too. So good to see all of you here joining me. A big hello and a wave to all of you, as I will get to you guys after my guest departs. But just to let you guys know, I do have a guest today. And so we'll be having a very deep and substantive, nuanced discussion. So I can't wait to get into that. So what are we talking about today? Well, later in the show today, we actually have a story that I want to touch on. Has actually happening here in Florida. We're going to be talking about, so cops made and sold crack. Absolutely. This is a story that is actually gaining ground here in Florida. And it actually talks about policing here and how they basically manipulated the system in order to add to the carceral system, add to mass incarceration in our state. And it's very likely that it's happened in other states as well. I wouldn't put it past them. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But first, we're actually going to be talking about fact versus fiction about North Korea. I want to get into this because everybody and their mama here in the United States has some type of thing against North Korea. But why are you against North Korea? What is it that you do not like about them? What are the facts versus what is the lies that are being told about this country? For that, I would like to introduce my guest, Juhyun Park. I'm sorry, did I say your last name correctly?
Oh yeah, that's good.
Okay, good to have you with us today. Nice to have you, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, James. Big fan of your work and also of everything that the Revolutionary Blackout Network is doing. So happy to be here and happy to be part of this important conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Now, as far as I know, you've been speaking out really against the capitalist system for some time now. I've been noticing a lot of your tweets, and you actually have some really great takes, especially what's going on within our country. As far as, the system here, I know this isn't one of my questions, but I was kind of thinking, is the United States everything that they say North Korea is? Is it kind of like that?
Well, I think, that's a fair place to start. Let's think about what the U.S. says about North Korea or the Democratic People's Republic, DPRK. The narrative is that it is a repressive prison state, that, there is a ruling class that dominates the entirety of society, that it's a country that is expending all of its money on its military capacities at the expense of its people. But if we take any single one of those statements and apply them to the United States, I think we'll also find that they hold a lot of water, right? We know for a fact that in the US today, there is very little opportunity for class mobility. If you are not born into the wealthiest sector of the population, you are very unlikely to rise to that level. We know that money plays a huge role in politics. Corporations can exercise political rights as if they were individuals. And that means that they can leverage billions of dollars to manipulate the electoral system in a way that you and I just can't do, right? And then, of course, let's not even get started on, the prison system in the United States, right? I mean, we've been hearing horrific things, particularly in the last few weeks coming out There's lawsuits in Alabama against forced labor in prisons. There's a situation you just described in Florida where the police are apparently making and selling crack cocaine. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, so I don't know much about the specifics of what's going on there. But I think, we can certainly say that the US is in its own right a repressive society that expends way too much money on the military, where the freedoms of everyday people are severely restricted and limited. And, I think that a lot of what the US does say about the DPRK is not only about serving its geopolitical ends, but also ultimately about projection, right? It's about telling the people of the US, you've got to be so grateful for everything that you're stuck with here, because it could be so much worse somewhere else, right? And I think that is a narrative and a mentality that you'll encounter among lots and lots of people here in the United States. So I'm sure that folks will know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so very much for that. Now, my first question is, and that was kind of a bonus question, but my first question is North Korea, which is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is that a democracy? And if so, then how are their elections done and system of government set up?
I think that's a great question. I think it's one of the most important things to understand about the DPRK, which is the intricacies of its political system. Now, I would classify the DPRK system as democratic. And the reason for that is, what does democracy mean? It essentially means rule by the people, right? This is something that is enshrined in the constitution of the DPRK. It's reflected in the political processes of the DPRK and the organization of its society. Does it look like the US's democracy? No. And I think that is a point of major contention and confusion, because there is sort of an assumption that if a country is democratic, that means that it has to have either the kind of US style Jeffersonian system or the British parliamentary style of democracy, which are probably the most common that you'll find throughout the world today. But because the DPRK is a socialist country, it does operate in some different ways. And in order to kind of get into describing the system and the democracy there, I first want to take a little bit of detour through history. The DPRK was officially founded in 1948. That's 3 years after the end of World War II and the end of Japanese colonialism in Korea. But the origins of the DPRK's political system actually go back to the end of colonialism, when Korean people were establishing people's committees throughout the peninsula to exercise self-governance. Now, in the South, what ended up happening was that the US military imposed itself and actually abolished the people's committees. They declared them illegal, and they got rid of them through very repressive and violent means. But in the North, that's actually not the process that happened. The people's committees continued to be the fundamental basis of the political system. And in turn, they became sort of the seed that then became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea 3 years later in 1948. Now, as part of the People's Committee's governance in Northern Korea at the time, one of the first things they did was hold local elections beginning in 1946. And these were actually the first free elections in Korean history that were based on the principle of universal suffrage and the secret ballot, which are taken as, kind of the most basic thing you need to have in a democracy, right? Everybody gets one vote. Your vote isn't something that's made public that can then be coerced to be changed, things of that nature. And I want to share an excerpt from a US journalist, Anna Louise Strong, who was in North Korea in this time. And this is from a book of hers called In North Korea, First Eyewitness Report, that was published in 1949. The context of this is that she was talking to a woman who was a minor in her community about the political process that was underway and the elections that had taken place. Now, something that Anna Louise Strong, the US journalist, took issue with was that there was only one candidate. And this is something that surprises a lot of people about the electoral process in the DPRK, but I'm going to explain the way that it works. But to quote the woman that Anna Louise Strong was interviewing, this was her response. She said, quote, "We all knew the candidate. We all liked him. We all discussed him. The political parties held meetings in our minds and factories and found the people's choices. Then they got together and combined on the best one, and the people went out and chose him. I don't see what's wrong with this or why the Americans don't like it. I don't see what the Americans have to say about it anyway." And I think that kind of gets to the fundamental difference in terms of how these elections work, right? In the United States and in a lot of other capitalist countries, you have competitive elections where different parties will pose a candidate that are supposed to represent different platforms, different agendas. And then the election is the process by which a determination is made. And, there's sort of a political struggle that happens in terms of, what actually reflects the best interests of the society, or, really in most cases, who has the most money and is able to effectively convince the most people to vote for them, right? But in a socialist state, the society and government are organized through the party and through mass organizations. That's something that's really important to understand. So what that means is that functionally, everyone has a daily role in political life. So if you're a young person, you are part of your local youth association. If you're a worker, you take part in managing your workplace with your coworkers. And all or most of these organizations have some relationship to the Workers' Party, which is the ruling party. But the Workers' Party itself is composed of millions of members. About 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people in the DPRK are part of the Workers' Party of Korea. So this is a very, very different system fundamentally than what we have in other countries. For instance, I think a lot of us would be hard pressed to name someone we know on a personal basis who is part of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And I don't mean that in the sense of knowing a Democratic or Republican voter, right? Being a registered voter is very, very different than being a cadre of a party who is embedded in the decision-making process and the political processes of a political organization, right? That's just not the way that these parties work in the United States, right? It's a very, very small clique of people. They don't have these connections to these wider organizations that represent a mass of society. And so the way that it works is just different. And so what that means is that, yes, the elections are not necessarily competitive in the DPRK, but the system is different because there is a process by which mass organizations, the party, which also reflects a broad base of people, nominates and selects single candidates based on ongoing discussion about what is needed and who is best to sort of rise to those occasions. So the election itself, the actual process of voting, is more about ratifying that decision rather than being the be-all, end-all of making the choice of who's going to assume office. And so because the whole of society is already involved in governance at different levels, there's a lot less pressure on the election as the sole kind of outlet for democratic expression. And, I can get a little bit more into the structure of how, the DPRK works as a political system. I am seeing a lot of thinking gestures from you. So I don't know if you have a follow-up question you wanted to ask.
Well, so from what it sounds like to me is that it is, as far as, let me ask this one question first, a follow-up question. Would the person who is in the governing structure, do they decide themselves to run for office and then get chosen by the people? Or is it kind of like here in the United States, Socialist Alternative, where they say, you're going to be our guy and we nominate you no matter if you sought it out or not? Is it kind of like that?
Yeah, it's more of the second process. I think I don't know all the details of every single person who's been nominated. Maybe some of them have nominated themselves. I'm not clear on that. But generally speaking, because it's a collective process, it's not about whoever says they want to be, in a certain position and those are the only people we consider, right? It's much more of a process where the actual relevant local organs and mass organizations sit down and they're like, all right, what does this position require? Who are the leaders in our society who can be entrusted with these responsibilities, right? And when I say leaders, I mean, these are people who, leaders make themselves apparent in a society, right? When, you have a real social process, there are people who take on more responsibility than others, who demonstrate, strength of character, other things that would make people want them to be in an official position. So I think that's sort of the best way I can respond to your question.
Okay, so this reminds me of one time. This was the cool part. So I used to work for a furniture store. Mm-hmm. We were all sales associates, and we didn't have. I think we needed a manager, and we were in the process in between of getting a manager to the store. So we needed somebody to help manage the store in the meantime. And we all said, hey, we think it should be so-and-so. And then everybody started saying, yeah, we all like him. He's a great guy. He's been in this business for 20 something years. And we all have a great rapport with him. So we all just out of the blue just chose him. Right.
Yeah.
It was basically like, hey, you've been chosen to serve. And he's like, if you guys want me, okay. And it was like, and it worked out so well because we chose him. He didn't even say, oh, I'll do it. We were like, no, you're going to do it. And it was great. And that's what it sounds like it is in DPRK.
Yeah, I think, that's a very apt sort of comparison, right? And I think, like when leadership is based on that, it's much better than like when you just have these people that are always like maneuvering and scheming to like try to like, work their way to the top, whether that's like at a company or in like, formal political office and things of that nature. To get a little bit into like the actual structure of the system, basically the way that it works is that there are people's assemblies at all levels of the society, from like your local municipality to like neighborhoods and big cities, all the way to the national organ, which is called the Supreme People's Assembly. And this is actually the highest organ of state power. So the highest organ of state power in the DPRK is the legislature. And those deputies are elected for 4 years. They don't receive a salary and they actually continue with their previous jobs. So they don't like form this class of, like Nancy Pelosi's and other people who become like professional politicos, right? And they're also subject to immediate recall, which is different than the way the US works. Like you can't recall a senator in the US, right? That's how you end up with like John Fetterman's, who like, was elected by people who wanted a liberal senator and is very clearly not acting like one, right? And so, the SPA, the Supreme People's Assembly, as, the highest authority, also holds responsibilities like appointing the Supreme Court and also electing the State Affairs Commission, the chairman of which is Kim Jong-un. And so what that means is that Kim Jong-un does have a boss. It is, the Supreme People's Assembly. And, the body that he oversees, the State Affairs Commission, is only the highest policy body. But its authority derives still from the legislature. So what that means is that he doesn't have a body that can enact its own laws, right? They can make suggestions, they can put items on the agenda for the Supreme People's Assembly to consider, but they can't just unilaterally go out and say, this is the way things are, right? Outside the realm of policy decisions that are within their authority as the executive. So that's just kind of a basic sketch of how the actual political system works, and we could break into that a bit more, but I know you have other questions. So
so the supreme leader of the DPRK is the people, and the person who kind of coordinates is the person that they're like, okay, Kim Jong-un, you're coordinating for us.
I think that's a pretty good description of it. Supreme leader is a title that Kim Jong-un holds, but then the authority that he has, what I'm saying is the authority is not actually absolute, right? It's not all areas of government that he himself is able to personally change, right? Of course, he's very influential, right? He can make recommendations, he can, maneuver politically to get things done. But then according to like the way the government is actually structured, it's the legislature that holds that supreme authority.
Okay. Thank you so very much for that. Due to the sake of time, and because I have dude, you just brought up a million more questions in my head. This is so fascinating, but I also want to be respectful of your time because I know you're a very busy person, so I got to be respectful. But my next question is there homelessness in DPRK? And if so, is there a rate of homelessness that can be measured? And is there home ownership?
So these are all really great questions. I think when it comes to the issue of homelessness and housing, the sort of immediate response I can give is, well, there isn't like a rate of homelessness that's like published. So I can't give you statistics and figures, but I can describe the way that property ownership works and sort of the different dynamics that may or may not lead to the existence or non-existence of homelessness. So to begin with, housing is guaranteed as a constitutional right in the DPR.
Constitutional right.
Yeah, it's a constitutional right. And so, and as part of that, because it's also a socialist system, what that means is that real estate land is not commodified. You can't buy and sell and accumulate homes as a private individual or entity the way that you can in a capitalist system. People do acquire personal property based on their contributions to cooperative work, based on basically like how much they've given to the society, but there's limits to how much they can own in terms of land. And so as to the existence of homelessness, I think there's a couple of conditions to consider. The first is that, the DPRK has been hit by some pretty severe climate disasters, especially in its recent history. And I think in those situations, we can say that, yeah, there are people who become effectively homeless because their home was washed away by a flood or something of that nature, right? But the way that this is handled in the DPRK is very, very different than in other places. For instance, there was major flooding in North Pyongan province this year, and there were thousands of people who had to be relocated, but they're being sheltered in the capital, right? And so, they're not in their own like personal home the way they were when like before the floods happened, but they're in this kind of transitional state where like they have to wait for the new housing to be constructed in order to have that in the first place, right? Another dynamic I think to consider is that, the DPRK, Korean culture places a lot of emphasis on like kind of staying within the family, even as an adult, right? This is also common in South Korea, where like you become an adult, your parents don't kick you out, you stay with them until you get married, right? And in a lot of cases, you get married and then you just keep living with your parents. But if there is strife within a family, I could see scenarios where like people feel they have to leave, right? But I think what we can effectively say is that there is not strong evidence of a permanent class of homeless people in the DPRK, like there you find in a lot of capitalist countries, right? Particularly in the United States. And that's because, the property relations that determine housing are so different, for all the reasons that I just described. And, the government also places a huge emphasis on ensuring that there is a consistent supply of modern housing available to people. That's actually one of the chief priorities of the DPRK right now, and it has been for the last few years, to build 50,000 modern apartments in Pyongyang, which will be free, for the workers that receive them. And then there are corresponding initiatives that are being undertaken in rural areas to also make sure that not only does everyone have housing, but that this housing, is fit for the conditions of human beings, and that, it is modern up to a certain standard, and that, people can expect to have things like electricity, like clean running water, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow. And I'm just thinking about, because there will be people who will say things about, especially when they're talking about China, they'll be like, oh my God, they got cities where buildings where they don't have anybody inhabiting them. And my thing goes, well, we have 16 million vacant homes here in the United States.
Yeah.
And we literally have homeless people. But let China or DPRK have cities empty with buildings, but they have no homelessness because they're preparing for future people to move into them as the population grows. That sounds more logical to me than what we have here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's a planned economy, right? So the needs of housing are not about what's going to make BlackRock the most money, right? What's going to make, this or that millionaire developer even more rich. It's around how many people do we have and how many houses do they need to, achieve a certain standard of living that's within the kind of like cultural norms of the society.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's pretty awesome. I'm not going to lie. And as somebody that knows what it's like to be homeless and knows what homelessness feels like, even as a child, just to be able to, I don't know, just got to be some really deep sense of security. And it's got to be a culture shock. Like if I were somebody that moved from the DPRK and having that life and then move here to the States, it would be a shock to my system just to know what homelessness feels like. It would rattle me.
Yeah, even from some other capitalist countries. I mean, like Europeans or like South Koreans, Japanese, they come to the US and like, oh my God, what are you guys doing? What's going on, right? Because it's so apparent and it's so glaring, right? And I mean, like, it's just something we're forced to accept as normal, but like, why should the daily grinding suffering of our fellow human beings be something that we ever accept, right? I mean, it's a crying shame that, I mean, I live in New York and like, I forget the exact figure, but it's something like over 100,000 children in the public school system that experience homelessness at some point in the academic year. I mean, that's This is the city with the most like billionaires on the planet, and this is the condition that we're allowing children to grow up in. I mean, that's just unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel you there. I also want to move on to my next question about, does DPRK have universal health care, and do they provide health care to foreigners or for free, or do they have to pay?
So healthcare is another right guaranteed under the Constitution. And the healthcare system has actually been praised by international bodies like the World Health Organization. So you don't have to like take my word for it in terms of what the standard of healthcare that's offered is. There are international bodies, you know, under the UN, which is not always a friendly organization to North Korea, that, you know, corroborates this, right? That doesn't mean that the healthcare system doesn't face challenges, right? Particularly under sanctions. So a lot of medical equipment, for instance, can't be imported into the DPRK because it's classified under something that's called dual use. And what that means is that according to the sanctions writers, these items could potentially have civilian and military applications. But there's a very intentionally wide definition that's used, and it ends up creating problems for the DPRK. For instance, things like catheters, syringes, X-ray machines, MRIs, these are all classified as dual use under the sanctions regime. So the DPRK actually can't import them. If they want these things, they have to develop them on their own. And there is a report from the organization Korea Peace Now that was written studying, you know, the effects of sanctions solely in the year 2018, only looking at the impact on UN health programs. And it concluded that close to 4,000 people died in that year because of delays and disruptions to the healthcare system that were caused by these sanctions. And the majority of those people were children under the age of 5. So, you know, the healthcare system in the DPRK is not perfect, but it's way more advanced and it's way more universal than you will find certainly in countries that have a similar level of GDP. There's a scene from the documentary Crossings where, you know, all these different women's leaders from around the world went to the DPRK. One of them was from Liberia, right? And they visited a hospital. It's actually I found this a little bit humorous because there were a number of, you know, Americans who were on the trip as well, and like they were kind of just like on edge the entire time, and you could see it from the way they were like conducting themselves on camera. But then this Liberian woman, they visited this this NICU, right? This like ICU for infants, and she was enthralled. She was like watching as they were like, you know, taking care of like a premature baby and things like that, using standards of, you know, medical health that, you know, I think is very, very difficult to find in the global South generally, right? So I think that speaks to kind of what has managed to be achieved in the DPRK in spite of all of these things. I would also point out, you know, the DPRK has historically shared some of this expertise with the world. They actually, North Korean doctors played a huge role in revolutionary Mozambique and helping to build the healthcare system there. Now, as to your question about foreigners, I actually don't know what happens if you're a foreigner and you go to the DPRK and you need healthcare. So I can't answer the question with full accuracy. I don't think they would just let you die. But if you were planning to go there for medical tourism reasons, maybe that is not, maybe you'll need to find more information before you make that decision.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about how it's difficult for countries like Cuba because of the embargo. Mm-hmm. Because of the sanctions that are happening there, and it makes it a lot more difficult, even when it comes to medical services for them to be able to do for their people, really, because it's the United States is, you know, murdering their population by proxy. Mm-hmm. And as far as, you know, foreigners, of course, you know, if I were to go to another country for medical treatment, I'd probably go to China because I don't want to help exhaust the needs of the medical system in a place like DPRK, because it's like I want to make sure that their people, you know, is reserved for their people so that they don't exhaust, because it is easily exhaustible because of what the United States and the West is really doing there. So, of course, you know, even though I would love to be able to get my dialysis there while visiting, I'm not going to be able to, but it's all good. I'll go after transplant. But yeah, so thank you very much for that. Of course, that was kind of an easy question because it's like North Korea, do they have universal healthcare? It's like kind of duh. But My next question is, are North Koreans allowed to go to websites outside of the DPRK like Chinese citizens? If yes, are they advised to use a VPN?
So this is a really interesting question, and it's something that I think is kind of shifting a lot, particularly in recent years. So I'm going with the information I have, but I'll add the caveat that, like, I think this is part of one of the things about the DPRK that's the hardest to know from the outside. And so part of the reason is because the DPRK has an infranet, not internet. By that I mean it's not connected to the wider global internet system. And the reason for that is, very similar to why, countries like China have the Great Firewall, or why, like Cuba, was not permitting the use of like certain social media sites for a while. And it's because these global telecommunications are dominated by the US, right? It's US companies, it's US technology, it's US infrastructure in terms of like
True.
the fiber optic cables that are running everywhere. So the DPRK, has sought to create their own system, and that's, both to guard against information warfare, but also cyber warfare. An example of that is, I think in the Bush or Obama years, there was something called the Stuxnet virus, which was developed by the US and Israel to specifically attack the DPRK and Iran, right? So they're not just like being paranoid here. They are responding to like a real threat environment, right? Which they have experience with. As to the use of VPNs, I've come across some reports from Western tech companies that indicate that they have found VPN IPs from the DPRK. The reason for that is because there's been some investigations into companies that have inadvertently ended up hiring DPRK firms who have, presented themselves as not being in the DPRK, probably using some of these VPNs. But the reason why, those firms are doing that is because they're trying to get around the sanctions regime. They're trying to find ways to, still conduct commerce and, support the economy in the DPRK. Now, when it comes to individual access and use of the internet, I think it's safe to say that it's not universal. And I think the biggest barrier there is actually still sanctions, actually still these conditions of war, because you have to remember the DPRK can't just like start importing Apple iPhones tomorrow, right? They're blocked from doing that. So if they want to create smartphones, they want computers, they basically have to make them on their own. Maybe counting on some components from other countries, but a lot of it is going to have to come from them, right? And so what that means is that, not everyone is going to have a personal electronic device in the way that we're used to seeing in a country like the United States, right? Like people aren't going to have like a laptop and a phone and a tablet, right? Smartphones are becoming more common, but I think, personal computers are still not really a thing for most people. So what that means is that if people are going to access, the web in the DPRK, they're going to do it through work at like a work computer that's like physically at the office, or through school, at like a university library, something of that nature. There's also an initiative now to build what's being called SciTech centers around the country. And these are places where people can come for like cultural enrichment, access to research and education, which includes, access to the web and to computers, and also receiving training on, how to use that kind of technology. So I think it's something that will change in the coming years, but for now, it's probably not the case that like every single person in the DPRK can go on the internet whenever they want to, but a lot of that has to do with the actual conditions of the DPRK at this time.
Yeah, because it sounds like just more further expanded libraries like what we have here. It's just, we have media centers and things like that as well as here too. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, pretty cool. I mean, trying to do what they can for this, to help people embrace technology without risking their state or the people at all. I get it. So another one is that I have is, does DPRK have mandatory military service or conscription?
They do. And military service is mandatory for all able-bodied citizens. It can last up to 10 years for men and up to 8 years for women. And, that is a long time, but the length of the service actually depends on the specific roles and duties that individuals adopt. Also, the needs of the country at different times. So I believe, there are some changes that sometimes happen in terms of, how long this conscription lasts. The DPRK also has armed citizens militias, similar to the, Committee to Defend the Revolution in Cuba. And, these are groups that organize for the defense at the local level. And so what that means is that functionally the entire citizenry is trained in the use of weapons and has reasonable access to them, right? It's not necessarily like people having like individual huge gun collections, but there are armories and stuff like that. It's publicly known where they are, how to access them, who kind of like monitors what goes in and out of there. And I think that's important to understand the nature of that conscription and how it really works in the DPRK. And one thing I would add is that conscription it's an inter-Korean reality. In South Korea, there's mandatory conscription. It is shorter. It does, apply only to men. But the condition that's driving this is the unfinished Korean War, right? The Korean War, there was an armistice in 1953. There has never been a conclusive peace agreement. So all the parties that are involved in that war are legally still at war, right? And so for North Korea, they have to take this very, very seriously because they are the ones who paid the most dearly in that war, right? There were something like 3 to 5 million people that died in the Korean War. And it's generally acknowledged that more than half of that figure was from the DPRK alone. I could get into the severity of the war crimes that the US was enacting in North Korea. I think, honestly, that would take a little too long and frankly be a little bit too personally upsetting. But I think what we can say is that the DPRK continues to face constant threats, right? In 2023, the US had more than 200 days of war games in Korea, right? So more than half the year, they're conducting some kind of military exercise that has some application to a war with North Korea, right? And this year, they also began rehearsing plans for how they would coordinate a nuclear strike on Korea. So these are the threats that the DPRK is facing directly, and they're also looking around the world at Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Somalia. We could go on, right? And so they understand that the threat of US imperialism is very, very real. So it is something that they take seriously. And I think that is, something that is kind of throughout the society, because even if you're a person in the DPRK who may have some issues with your government, that does not mean that you want to see your home city burned to the ground by US bombers, right? So self-defense and national defense are things that are very, very top priority for the government and for the people.
Yeah, so it kind of don't make this too funny, but it's kind of funny how first of all the United States wants to do to DPRK what they did to Libya. This is why DPRK is like, no, we're going to have a nuke because you guys aren't messing with us. And another thing is like, we as Americans do not want to mess with DPRK because if everybody's conscripted, that means men and women, and that means that everybody knows how to carry a peace. That means it behooves us to not go to war with a country like that because they will kick our asses. So it's just hilarious to me. Like, they will demonize this country, and meanwhile, it's like they know how to fight. Why are we having bad relations with them in the first place? Like, we need to be diplomatic. It's weird how and I do not like Donald Trump at all, but him trying to soften relations with the DPRK, I actually think is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying is exactly right. They do this thing in US media where they always present a US enemy as both diabolically evil and powerful and like completely weak and flimsy, right? Logically, it doesn't hold, right? You can't say that something is a global threat and also that, they pose no threat at the same time, right? I think what we can say is the DPRK has very, very powerful military capabilities. It's also a society where the entire population is prepared to engage in self-defense, right? And not just like mentally, like they know how to operate the weaponry. They know how to coordinate themselves, in units in order to effectively fight back. What that means is that in any situation of US invasion, there's going to be huge casualties, both for like the invading US force and for, the domestic population. And so this is a war we have to be avoiding by all means, just for the very basic human reason that millions of people should not die, for no like real gain to humanity. Right. And I think that, I agree, like any measures that are taken by US leaders to try to reduce tensions with the DPRK are a good thing and should be supported.
Yeah, thank you. My next question is college education free, or do citizens have to pay a tuition?
Education is also guaranteed under the Constitution. There's no private like education system, you know. There aren't like alternate schools that, you know, you have to like pay to get into. There aren't like these like big like ed tech companies or things of that nature that are, you know, like siphoning money off of the public system and things like that. You are guaranteed a universal education up to the equivalent of like a high school diploma. And then, you know, the majority of people then by that point have either like determined, you know, what industry they're going to go into and then kind of like go into that, or they receive continuing education in the form of college or more advanced degrees. If, you know, like that is the path for them. Right. And I think there's a lot of like interesting things about the way the education system works. For instance, like basically everyone receives some level of technical training before they even graduate college. So what that means is that as like a teenager, you know how like the local industries in your community work. You have some sense of like what the real world and the economy is like, and you can actually start thinking as an adolescent, like, you know, where do I want to fit into like the grander society? Now, of course, teenagers in America also work, but you do that on top of school. It's not part of school, right? So, you know, it is a different system, and it's more geared towards like actually trying to help people like find, you know, their place in life, rather than, you know, being forced into a situation where you have to work because like, you know, your parents aren't making enough. You have to help support around the house. You have personal things that you want, which, you know, your family can't provide for, things of that nature.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. Is school year round, or do they have like summer breaks like we do?
I'm actually not sure about that. I would need to check, but
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine it's probably more year round, especially because I you know, they have cold winters there in DPRK. So,
yeah, generally in South Korea, at least, like the winter break is the longer break. Yeah, because it's like, you know, it's just more logical in like a temperate climate. Like, why pay to keep the school warm when you could just have the kids at school during the summer? So,
basically, yeah. Thank you so much. Now, this is one of the fun questions I wanted to know. Is marijuana legal or decriminalized in things like alcohol, tobacco, and other substances?
So alcohol and tobacco are legal. Tobacco is like very commonly grown. You go to even South Korea, everyone's smoking, or I guess they're vaping now, but, you know, tobacco consumption is a big part of our culture. It's got its positives and its negatives. For anyone listening who is not a smoker, more negatives. Don't start because, you know, I gave this interview. I have read some tourist accounts of smoking hemp flower. And, you know, hemp has many, many uses, right? It's related to the kind of like commercial cannabis plant that, you know, people use to get high. In terms of like, is there like a consistently strong culture of like smoking like marijuana that is like similar to what you would find in the West? I find that a little bit difficult to say. There is like testament from like even like from like previous centuries of, you know, Koreans, you know, smoking some marijuana, but I don't think that like what is grown is like so potent that like it's necessarily seen in the same like recreational way. I've never tried it myself in North Korea, so I can't speak to the quality of it by any means. But, you know, I think it's just kind of a little bit of a different history in terms of like the relationship to the plant family. And I think that kind of like structures the way things work. And I think also, you know, the culture around drug consumption in East Asia differently is pretty distinct, or at least traditionally has been. And, you know, I think in North Korea, I would venture to guess that it's probably not something that is like encouraged or something I would necessarily tell people, oh yeah, go there and try that. I don't think it's something that like is being super heavily monitored, but, you know, it's also just the sort of thing where like, you don't really know like the full context around it. And, you know, I wouldn't say that the DPRK will be the next great cannabis tourism destination.
Yeah. I heard that it's not illegal, but it's not legal. It's just kind of like not even really thought of that much. I don't know, but I hope to be able to visit one day,
Mhm.
just to ask around,
Yeah.
just to see. But my next question is, what's the relationship with South Korea like? At one point a decade ago, there were talks about reconciliation, reunification, when the South had left-leaning leader, and especially what's going on now with President Yoon, where he tried to do a martial law, a
Mhm.
call for martial law. So, what is it like?
Yeah. So relations right now are at a historic low, probably the worst they've been since the Korean War armistice. So I need to start with that. And I think we can say this is pretty much entirely because of the Yoon administration in South Korea and their backers in Washington, right? There's details coming out today in the South Korean parliament, and these have not been corroborated and fully confirmed yet. I do want to start with that kind of disclaimer, but according to what is being heard, in the National Assembly right now, there may have been a plot to effectively create like a false flag operation to make it look like there was a North Korean attack, or to find some way to justify an attack on North Korea as part of the overall coup plans, right? If everything had gone according to the way that President Yoon wanted it to. So, things are very, very bad in terms of the inter-Korean relationship right now, and a lot of it has to do with the current government, which I need to point out 13% approval rating for this president. So this man does not have any kind of basis of political legitimacy from his society. It's coming from US imperialism. That's why he's been able to kind of like stay in power for even this long, right?
Yeah.
Now to get into the more general question, I think, to start, the thing to understand about Korea in general is that there really is just one national identity. And that is something that makes Korea unique in the world, given its history, because prior to the division of Korea, which was a decision made by the United States, not by Korean people, the peninsula was territorially united for at least 1,000 years. Korea also doesn't have like these huge linguistic differences that you might find in a lot of other countries. There is some scholarly debate about like, do certain dialects, particularly the language spoken on Jeju Island, are they technically distinct languages? But it's not the same as, say, in like Spain, where you have like Basque and Catalan and, Castilian and other languages that, like are not actually mutually intelligible, are very, obviously distinct languages and things like that. So Koreans have been one people with more or less one language and a contiguous national culture for a very long time. And dividing Korea was never something that the majority of Korean people supported. So the DPRK's policy from the 1970s until actually this year to pursue peaceful reunification with the South on an independent basis, meaning they were in support of a process that would be led by Koreans, decided by Koreans, and would not involve foreign actors. And things have changed a lot because of the events of the last 10 years. The failure of the Trump-Kim dialogues really showed the DPRK that diplomacy with the US is a dead end, right? And then once Yoon Suk-yeol came into power in 2022, things really, really turned bad very quickly. He's done a lot to destroy relationships between the two Korean governments. Last year, he declared that the DPRK is South Korea's so-called main enemy, which is just like, what are you doing as a country saying you have a main enemy? What does that mean? This is not like some kind of children's show or something. And so, the DPRK has responded in kind and also classified the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as a hostile state. So this is a very tense situation. It's a really heartbreaking situation. I think what it shows at the end of the day is what a huge barrier US imperialism is to peace and reconciliation in Korea, and how imperative it is that Korean people need to be fighting against imperialism. We need to be struggling to actually have sovereignty, in our country, because that's not something that exists in South Korea, at least right now, and that's a huge part of the equation in terms of what is a politically possible future. And part of an organization called Norutol that recently launched a US out of Korea campaign. I would really recommend people check it out. You can go to usoutofkorea.org to like read more about our demands and stay up to date with what we're doing. But this is something that I think is very, very important and actually really needs to be addressed, because the closer Korea gets to war, the closer not only the US gets to another war, in Asia, but actually the world, because China is right next door. Russia is right next door, right? And we know that East Asia is a place where imperialists are looking to start another front in what is already quickly devolving into World War III vis-a-vis the Middle East and Ukraine, right? So
Yeah,
this is one area where, like, there's a lot going on in the world right now, but we do need to keep our eye on the ball in order to help preserve some prospects of peace out of this very, very ugly global situation that we're in.
absolutely. Thank you so very much for that and saying that, because I mean that this is why we're trying to change the system from the inside, because the empire is just getting too radical in a fascistic direction, all over the world. One of my final questions is, what's DPRK's level of interest in BRICS? Would there be political implications of what would be the political implications of DPRK potentially joining BRICS? And would there be any objections from BRICS countries?
I think this is a really interesting question. The DPRK is in a position now where they are actively seeking stronger ties with the wider world. Since the 90s, they've suffered a lot of isolation because of US domination of the international system, because of US sanctions. The US really can't enforce those sanctions anymore, right? Particularly after trying to sanction Russia. Russia's right next door to the DPRK. Now they're in a strategic partnership, right? So what that indicates is that, there's more and more opportunities that are being created for the DPRK to engage in exchanges with the wider world. And I think as those efforts continue, we will see a huge transformation take place, particularly in the next 10 to 20 years, I would say. I'm willing to, stake a lot of things on that. I say, come back in a decade or two, we're going to be talking about a very different country. Now, the DPRK has not actually expressed interest in joining BRICS. And, I think there are several potential explanations for that. They haven't been very clear about what that logic is, but I think that from their standpoint, it is more important for them to build bilateral relations with key partners who can help them with their actual immediate needs, right? Rather than joining like this big sort of dialogue like BRICS, which is made up of many, many different kinds of countries, not all of which are really that committed to, engaging in any kind of anti-imperialist front, right? And I think an example of that is, Venezuela was recently vetoed from joining BRICS, right, as a result of the bill. So I think, that there's probably some anticipation, particularly after that the DPRK would face similar barriers. That doesn't mean that the DPRK can't benefit from BRICS and other processes, even if it isn't formally a part of it. For instance, they're talking about the formation of eventually having a BRICS currency. If that were to come to pass, I think that could be very beneficial. I think even the kind of like bilateral trade relations that are building up, which are circumventing the dollar, particularly among BRICS nations, also helps the DPRK, because that creates precedent. It establishes other platforms by which the DPRK can engage in international trade. Right now, the DPRK cannot trade in US dollars, and US dollars have been the dominant form of international trade for many, many decades. So that functionally means that, even if they're trying to do trade with countries that don't use the dollar as their national currency, they've been obstructed from being able to do that. So as, that kind of dollar-dominated system declines, there are more opportunities that are opening up for the DPRK, regardless of whether it's formally a member of BRICS or not.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The final question I have is, DPRK does not recognize the state of Israel. What actions has DPRK taken to oppose, resist, and stop the genocide in Gaza?
I think this is a great question. It's actually one of my favorite topics to research and talk about, particularly in the last year. So the DPRK, has a very long-standing relationship with the Palestinian Liberation Movement. They've never recognized the Zionist entity as a legitimate state. And they're one of the very few countries outside of the Arab and Muslim world that have, upheld this position. I believe it's only really Cuba, maybe also Venezuela or Nicaragua that have, maintained that stand. So in terms of the current situation, they've repeatedly denounced the genocide in Gaza. There are a lot of reports from US and Israeli military experts claiming that a number of arms that are being used by the Palestinian resistance are of DPRK origin. I myself am not a military expert, so I can't really, corroborate that one way or another. But there's a historic relationship here, right? And the DPRK has been very friendly to the PLO, the PFLP, other Palestinian factions, and has not only provided them with diplomatic support, but with material support, right? There's a number of leaders, Palestinian leaders, who have visited the DPRK. And so this is a very long-standing and deep relationship in a lot of ways. And it's part of a consistent pattern of the DPRK's historical support for anti-colonial struggles around the world. Examples of that include, Vietnam during as they were repelling the U.S. invasion. The DPRK also supported Mozambique and Angola in terms of providing training, in terms of providing supplies in the struggle against Portugal. They did the same thing with the ANC in South Africa, with SWAPO in Namibia, and with Zimbabwe in the struggle against apartheid and against Rhodesia. They were also part of the non-aligned movement. They've given economic assistance to countries like Grenada and Malta. So they have a very long history of this kind of engagement with the wider world. It runs very, very counter to this narrative of the DPRK as this kind of hermit kingdom that intentionally seals itself off from the world. I think a better way to look at it is that the US has done everything possible to isolate and limit the DPRK's contact with the wider world because they don't like the way that they engage on the world stage. And I think a last point is that, the DPRK has also supported the Palestinian movement indirectly through its relationships within the resistance axis. And it's actually played a very important role in developing the military capabilities of a lot of these actors, including Iran, including Hezbollah as well. It's believed, for instance, that, Hezbollah has this massive tunnel network in South Lebanon, right? Korea needed to develop a similar tunnel network during the Korean War, right? I'm not totally clear on the history of this, but I believe that, it is one of the first places where the strategy was pursued to the extent that it was in the face of an imperialist conflict, right? And so what the DPRK has done since then is not only build on that technical know-how, but actually helped to export it to other contexts. They played a huge role in developing the underground infrastructure of Vietnam during the Vietnam War, for instance. And it's believed that, they've done the same thing in Lebanon as well. And if that's the case, that probably means that there is some kind of indirect relationship to the tunnel network that's also being used by the resistance in Gaza. So the DPRK, has played all these different kinds of roles when it comes to the Palestinian movement. And it's part of its, contribution to the global anti-imperialist struggle, right? They're not purely doing this out of reasons of interest, but also of ideology, because fundamentally the DPRK is a revolutionary state that wants to see the defeat of imperialism at the world level.
Yeah. I honestly wish that China would take more of the DPRK stance when it comes to the Zionist state of Israel and supporting the Palestinian people, because I feel like they could do better. I would like to see it, copy what DPRK is doing in that regard too. So I just want to thank you for that. And I have went over the amount of time that I promised you. I promised you 45 minutes. We went over.
Really great conversation. And I mean, to add to that final point, I think, I think we all wish that there was a stronger anti-imperialist force in the world, and we often look to China to play that role. I think part of what we're looking at is that China and North Korea, despite having been so close and undergone a lot of the same experiences, are in very, very different positions on the world stage today, right? And I think, there's a moral case to be made, and I would agree with it, that, we should all be doing everything possible for Palestine. But I think, it's also part of having a materialist analysis to look at the reality of our world today and understand that, different actors are taking different actions depending on the differences in their conditions, both where they're placed in the world and, what's going on internally. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining. And I appreciate, it was a privilege to have you on, to be educated, be educated along with my audience. And thank you so very much for being very generous with your time and answering these questions in a very nuanced way, because a lot of times nuance isn't very popular here in the West, so I appreciate it so much. And also, if you can let people know where they can find you and how they can support your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'll plug Norutol and the US Out of Korea campaign one more time. That's usoutofkorea.org, and you can find the organization on most social media. That's at NODUTDOL, at NODUTDOL. You can also, like follow me on Twitter. My handle is hermit_Hwarang. Hwarang is spelled HWARANG. And yeah, thanks so much again for having me on. This has been an excellent time. And, I hope we can do this again soon.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Juhyun Park, thank you so much for joining.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Have a good day. Bye-bye. All right, everybody. So I hope you learned as much as I did. I wanted to have somebody on who is educated about DPRK, aka North Korea, to educate us about what the country is, what the hermit, nation is, and kind of sift through and debunk a lot of the issues or a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we're told about this country, because a lot of times the corporatocracy wants you to think that any state that is ran by the people, the proletariat being the people, the working masses, the regular folks like you and me, that they are somehow under some authoritarian regime where they can barely move, when in reality it's completely the opposite. And I want to make this abundantly clear to anybody that's watching. When the United States tells you something, you really have to be very skeptical about what they say. It's like being in a relationship with somebody who's a known liar. Once in a while, they may tell the truth. Or once in a while, they will mix a truth with a lie in order to make it seem credible. But 9 times out of 10, you don't believe them. And this is how I view, like, for instance, when the State Department says something, or, when the Defense Department or the president or somebody from Congress or somebody from the Senate, if they say, oh man, North Korea does this or Cuba does that. Number one thing is to, talk to people from the region, talk to people, and not everybody you talk to from the region is going to corroborate what's being said by the United States. And some might. People like, I think her name was Yonomi Park, I think her last name is. Anyway, but some are, just like, for instance, some people believe certain things about the United States, and some people will corroborate it. Some people will corroborate it, but some people will be like, no, that's not the way it is here in the United States. And the thing is like, just like you'll have people who are massive Trump supporters who will be like, oh man, Trump was the greatest president. And then you'll have Biden supporters that'll go, oh man, Biden was the greatest president. And then you'll have people like me that go, no, they're both the same. Just one's just more orange. And so it's good to get your information from multiple sources, and then, try to see where the truth lies. And try to get, your truth from, try to get the truth from, real sources on the ground. Primary sources, that's the word I was looking for. And once you do that, then you'll know about what's real and what's fiction, what's facts, what's fiction. And that's what, I was hoping to do here, to be able to get more of the facts on the ground, because ultimately, when you have a nation that's ran by corporations and all they want to do is when all they want to do is dominate the resources and the people of a particular country while subverting their sovereignty and their self-determination, I look at that as you have ulterior motives against that nation. You have ulterior motives because you want what that nation has, versus I just want to learn about the people, their culture, and who they are, and, you know, be in solidarity with them. It's pretty much it. You know, people like me and these oligarchs, we're definitely not the same. They ain't like us. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that. Please keep all that in mind. So if you guys have not already, go ahead and do the thing and like the stream. Thank you so very much. That helps me out. It really does. Hey, do you guys like the lights? Well, it's a little bright in here, but the lights. I got the lights on. So thank you so very much for that as well. Now, we're going to go into the chat and let's say what's up, some peeps. Sarah, hellos. How you doing? All right, checking to see if I have any Rumble rants on Rumble. I am okay there. Thank you so very much for watching on Rumble. Let's go into Rockfin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Man, the Pointer Sisters, man, they were in their bag when they did that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Roger probably remembers that. All right, Roger says, what? He's in New York? New York? He's in New York. Black people. He's in New York. Put him in contact with me. I'm building an army to make the Citizen Ballot Initiative state. Okay, thank you. He says, universal public education with no private schools can work for a homogenous country. However, I don't think I want to depend on the system to teach our people about our history. Same goes for worker strikes today. Not only do they not tell us about American freedmen history, but all of the uprisings of workers, as Zeneb told me. Yeah, I mean, that, I'm kind of in between. I think that might be the necessary thing for maybe like the first 100 to 200 years after we implement a new system, you know, just so that, you know, we become more, just as we become more unified, you know, as far as the workers go. But I think eventually, you know, I think it will grow out of necessity. It'll become unnecessary, but I don't know. I'm kind of in between on it, but I do see the necessity for that as well, or at least having a sector where it is part of the system. I don't know. I don't want to take too much time on this, but I see both sides. I'll just put it that way. He says, I have a whole ton of stuff to tell you about your next story. You're going to be reading for a while. Oh gosh, Roger. You be giving me information overload, bro. Information overload. All right, let's say hello to everybody in the chat. DJ Leader coming in at the lead, saying, good morning, my beautiful RBN brother. Good morning to you. Good afternoon to you. Good evening to you. Nice to have you. Roger says, bam, what you talking about? Finally saw Django Unchained, my Steven impression. Oh, goodness gracious. Good to see you. Terry Connolly says, greetings, JB and comrades. Good to see you in here as well. Lauren says, hi, JB and chatters. Thank you so much for this important discussion. Thank you for coming in and watching. SCH says, well, obviously, we dislike North Korea because South Korea is best Korea. Just kidding. Katie Lewis, part of the RBN Orlando chapter, says, James, I'm so glad you were able to educate us where the state fails us. Thank you so very much for joining in. And also thank you for your submission of a question. I appreciate it. Jacqueline says, U.S. cops make and selling crack? Seriously, though, not surprised. Hey, everyone, by the way. Yes, Jacqueline, we're going to get into that story. That's going to be an interesting one. Lauren coming in saying, during my military tour at Kunsan Air Force Base in Republic of Korea, the wing commander prohibited military personnel from interacting with local Koreans living near the base. They feared we would learn the truth from, oh, I gotta see that. Hang on, because I know you got a continuation. I want to just read the rest of that. They'll learn the truth from North Korean sympathizers. Ooh. Okay. Thank you so very much. Sean Miller says, Jack, hope your birthday was... Oh, happy birthday, Jacqueline. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Finger guns. All right. Fireworks into the air. Good to see you. Thank you so very much for reminding me, Sean. Krona Ursa says, is there info on how U.S. citizens can visit North Korea? Oh, I don't know. Look, I'm going to take a educated guess here, but you cannot actively just leave the United States to go there. Like, there's no flights going there. You would need to get on a flight and fly probably to Beijing, maybe. I'm thinking. And then you can probably either fly in or ride in to North Korea. That's what I'm thinking. You would have to subvert. You have to go a roundabout way. You can't just go directly. It's the same thing with Cuba. You can't. There's no flights going in and out of Cuba. And I'm gonna tell you right now, if we were to open up, our relations with Cuba and allow traveling back and forth to Cuba, I'm telling you right now, there will be a ton of flights going in and out of Cuba. A ton. You go from Miami International, Orlando International, Tampa International. They'll be coming in and out of Atlanta. There will be flights coming in and out of New York, DC, Chicago. Because look, Cuba's not that far from Florida. So it would just be, people would just be doing direct flights. No kidding. Like, you can do a direct flight from Orlando to Cuba, maybe an hour flight tops, maybe an hour, maybe 45-minute flight. It's not that long. It's not that far. So that would be interesting. But I would love to live in a world where we can just fly to DPRK. Surfing to the Max says, what are the policies right now in regards to foreign visitors? Yeah, I didn't have time for that question. I'm sorry. There was a few questions I think I saw in the chat, but I just didn't have time. I had like 10 questions, and I wanted to make sure I got them all. I didn't, plus with nuanced answers, it takes a little bit more time. So, I'll try to see if I can have them on again in the near future, so I can ask more questions, more detailed questions in regards to the goings-ons in DPRK as well. But thank you so much. SCH is now in China. It's kind of like how companies should be. You pass a test and start at the bottom. Unless you have experience, then you get promoted if you're a good problem solver. Yeah. I love that point about basically, the person who they want is chosen. Like, it's not like I'll do it. It's more like you're gonna do it. It's like, wait, me? It's like, yes, you. Yeah, I love that. Unless they have some like huge objection to themselves doing it, then it's like, okay, we'll move on. But it's kind of cool. This was a good question too, Lauren. I'm gonna have to have him back on. But thank you so much. You'll be asking some great questions in here, man. Brilliant audience I have. I'm proud of the audience that I have, man. I am very proud because you guys are just brilliant people. You guys help me to be more brighter, more intelligent because of you all. You know, that's her name, Yeonmi. Did I say Yeonmi Park? I hope I said her name correctly. I don't like messing up people's names up. Katie Lewis says the U.S. government is pathological with its lies to the American people. Absolutely. Lauren says, I agree with you, JB. I also believe that no state's great leader of today has clean hands. So it seems more plausible to expect the patterns of gross corruption that exist globally. Yeah, I mean, there's also a lot of temptation too when you have, power. I hate to sound like Uncle Ben, but with great power also comes great responsibility. So we have Waddy Pilgrim coming in. Good to see you. Gio saying happy birthday to Jacqueline. Good to see you as well. Oh yeah, Gio says I wanted to visit DPRK ever since I woke up in 2020. Yeah, I want to go too. All right. Okay. Thank you, SCH. All right. Thank you so much. And GL says 100. 100. All right. So let me do a shout out to the patrons first. Can we do that? All right. So we're going to do a shout out to the patrons on Patreon because without you guys, is this channel run? Is this channel possible? Hell to the no. So let's go ahead and look at the tiers, see what we got here for all you beautiful people. All right. Thank you so very much to the patrons. We have Mega Jaybefaunters, Super Duper Jaybefaunters, Super Jaybefaunters, Jaybefaunters, Comrade, Solidarity, and JB members. And thank you to new members, Martin Flower and Chris Herring. Without you guys, we would not be able to do this work. And you guys literally keep the lights on. Literally. And just to let you guys know, my channel is demonetized. So if you like to support the channel, you can support via Patreon or PayPal, whichever you choose. Thank you very much. Also, I do also have a merch store, and I do also put some new merch on there. I put a new quote on there. If you guys would like to, that's also linked in the description below. So if you guys would like to, you guys can also do that too as well. All right, so still got sniffles, but recovering nicely. Now, let's get into the next and final story for today. We're going to talk about crack. So, cops made and sold crack. This was a interesting and it kind of confirms what I've always thought. Dirty cops are everywhere. They've been around for quite some time. And there is honestly some new revelations that are coming out in South Florida that we're going to be talking about in this subject, in this segment. But one of the things I want to start off with is the war on drugs. The war on drugs was a war that was started by Richard Nixon, former president of the United States in the 1970s. And this war on drugs had a specific objective. I want to get into that first before we get into this story, because this lays the groundwork for what is going on right now. So let me share this. 13, the prejudice of the Nixon drug policy. And I'll see you guys on either side.
We have launched an all-out offensive against crime, against narcotics, against permissiveness in our country.
The rhetoric of get tough and law and order was part and parcel of the backlash of the civil rights movement.
Nixon administration official has admitted that the war on drugs is all about throwing black people in jail.
So ultimately, the war on drugs is really just a divisive tactic to break up the working class. Because being Black in America is a class and identity issue, and they're tied together intrinsically, because how do you know somebody is a lower class? Well, you look at their skin color, right? That's how it was built. But you can't do that against white people who are on the left. So what other identifying factor do you have to do? Well, you got to do you got to focus in on actions. So to keep us divided and to keep us imprisoned, what do they do? Well, we'll associate uses of certain substances with these people and vilify them so that people, the other workers, will vilify them and reject them and look at them as lower people on the rungs of society. So then they are essentially ostracized by their own people. Meanwhile, in boardrooms across the nation, the same substances are being used on mirrors in boardrooms in our country. They are building snowmen all up and through this country, and yet somehow they're not vilified by society. But the people who are against the wars, the people who are Black people in this country, where we're actually trying to get from under the yoke of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. We're just wanting to have equality and equity. We're also being subject to these type of treatment here in the United States. Let me finish this, and then we can move on. So it says the prison population in the United States in 1970 was 357,292 people. And by 1980, the prison population went up to 513,900. Now, 1980, that was 44 years ago. So you can imagine the population explosion within our carceral system to this today. So I want to share that because this is what was going on with the Nixon administration in the war on drugs, was to suppress those of us, especially who are Black, especially people who are working class. Now, another thing that a lot of people did not realize is that at that same time, there was a other nefarious plot that was going on. The other nefarious plot that was happening was the CIA actually selling drugs to people in our neighborhoods, especially in Black neighborhoods. So I'm going to go here. And this is all very true. How the CIA was actually plotting and selling drugs to us.
In the 1980s, during the heart of the crack boom, violent crime spread like an insidious cancer. Families were forced into poverty, and fatal overdoses skyrocketed. Was this a horrible epidemic that the government failed to contain, or a sinister conspiracy organized by none other than the Central Intelligence Agency, aimed at disenfranchising African American communities and funding bloody government insurrections? Today, we're going to find out in an insane story that involves 2 U.S. presidents, a South American coup, journalists getting their lives and livelihoods destroyed, and an unimaginable pile of untraceable dark money. First, let's go back to June 1971, when President Richard Nixon started all this by formally declaring a war on drugs. According to Nixon, the use and abuse of narcotics was the public's #1 enemy, after the free-loving 60s normalized drug use in the states to an unprecedented degree. The war on drugs involved imposing stricter measures against drug-related crimes, such as mandatory minimum prison sentencing for even minor offenses. This was the first domino in a series that would have horrific consequences even today. As of the end of 2023, around 1.8 million Americans had been incarcerated within the U.S. 1 in 5 of the incarcerated population in the United States has been imprisoned for a drug-related offense, and this includes minor offenses like possession or even suspected possession. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, gave an interview in 1994 that expanded on the ulterior motives behind the war on drugs campaign, most of which revolved around Nixon wanting to keep the presidency. The main opposition to this, as Ehrlichman put it, were two demographics that were bound to not vote for old Tricky Dick, those being the left wing who were vehemently opposed to the ongoing Vietnam War, and black people who Nixon's Republican coalition had turned into a scapegoat. So why did Nixon have it out for black Americans? In the wake of the civil rights movement, the more radical black power movement started gaining momentum and was met with backlash from Republicans and white supremacists. Nixon used racial inequality as a wedge issue without actually addressing the systemic problems causing racial inequality in America. The war on drugs was a perfect cover to kneecap the movements that Nixon saw as a threat to his political power. As John Ehrlichman put it, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Back in the mid-70s, the war on drugs took a bit of a hiatus, and between 1973 and 1977, some states even decriminalized the possession of marijuana. In 1977, Jimmy Carter became president by running on a campaign of decriminalizing marijuana, and the Senate Judiciary Committee did vote to decriminalize possession of up to a single ounce of marijuana. It wasn't much, and it certainly didn't undo the damage done by the war on drugs, but it was a start. But if you're
So they tried, but it was not really successful because, of course, it's still on the schedule. And wasn't Joe Biden saying that he was thinking about decriminalizing it? How many weeks does Joe Biden have left? Joe Biden has what? 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 weeks left as president. He still didn't take it off the schedule. Wasn't Joe Biden also the same one that wrote the 94 crime bill, which also strengthens that war on drugs, that continuously helps the state to incarcerate people for something that's health related rather than crime related? Interesting. Very interesting. Let's continue.
you're wondering how any of this leads us to the CIA and crack smuggling, then you haven't been paying attention. All this context lays the groundwork for what would happen when the war on drugs saw a resurgence in the 80s, and Black Americans once again bore the brunt. Under the administration of Ronald Reagan, many of Nixon's earlier war on drugs policies were expanded upon and reinforced. Reagan was committed to passing more severe penalties for drug-related crimes in both congressional and state legislatures. This caused a massive boom in the number of incarcerations that occurred for those committing nonviolent drug crimes.
Now, I just want to make this point here, because yes, this was continuation with Reagan. The thing is that you got to remember that the 13th Amendment still makes an exception for slavery through incarceration. Go ahead and look up the 13th Amendment. So in order to keep more people to do free labor for these corporations, you need to have them in prison. Well, how do you get people to go into prison? Well, you make something that some people do to be an illegal thing, an illegal substance, right? I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to move to make caffeine illegal. And so because of that, that's how you get more people in prison to work for free, right? But they're in prison. They shouldn't have been doing something illegal. But if you make something that is a health issue illegal, then of course you're going to cast a wide net and grab a whole bunch of people, and then you're going to have them incarcerated in order to make the products that you want them to make without ever having to say, well, I don't want to do this for free. And then it's like, well, if you don't do this for free, then you're going to go into the box. This is basically how it is basically you're either going to be a chattel slave for us, or you're going to suffer and be tortured. That's essentially how the system is set up. So that's also part and parcel of what the CIA was doing.
Similarly to how things went under Nixon, mandatory minimum prison sentences for certain drug offenses were established in 1986 when Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. Many would later levy criticism against this law for having racist ramifications, as it mandated longer prison sentences for offenses that involved crack cocaine than it did for those that involved powder cocaine. Why? Well, because thanks to someone, more on the CIA in a moment, crack cocaine was more prevalent in predominantly Black American areas, while powder cocaine was more widely used among white Americans. A 5-year prison sentence was automatically given to anyone found with 5 grams of crack, while you need 500 grams of powder cocaine to land the same sentence. But you're probably wondering, just where did all that crack cocaine come from? How did it end up in the streets in the first place? Well, those are exactly the kind of questions that will have the nearest CIA agent shuffling awkwardly in their chair. To uncover the connection between the CIA and the crack that flooded U.S. cities in the 80s, we need to look away from the streets of LA or Miami and instead just head on over to the jungles of Central America. Just a year before the 1980 election that saw Ronald Reagan assume power, the dictatorial government of Nicaragua was overthrown. Huh? What does that have to do with the situation in America in the 80s? Well, as it turns out, everything. As the U.S. International Intelligence Agency, the CIA has a long and unnerving history when it comes to meddling in the affairs of other countries, especially when it starts to look like other nations might be tilting toward a left-wing or, heaven forbid, a socialist government. Then the Central Intelligence Agency swoops in to pull some strings in the shadows to get this country's leaders assassinated or overthrown. Of course, American clandestine intelligence experts can't be seen meddling like this, otherwise it would spark an international incident and possibly a war. So what the CIA prefers to do is bolster anyone in their target country who already opposes the new way of doing things. These are usually extreme right-wing paramilitary groups who suddenly receive a surprising amount of funding and even weaponry courtesy of the boys over at Langley. Here's a
So, does this sound familiar to any of you who maybe look, baby? I'm telling you right now, it's all connected. I'm gonna use my Jersey accent. It's all connected. Look, and this is why a lot of things that when we want to, for instance, end the war on drugs, when we want to implement more workers owning the means of production. You know why they don't want us to do that? Because then that would end the gravy train that these corporations have. It's all connected, right? This is part of the destabilization that happens where also it increases the amount of undocumented immigrants traveling from these places because they need the gangs in order to keep this system going. And then when the families don't want to do that, guess what? They travel here, sometimes undocumented, sometimes what they call illegally. And then they come here and they get exploited by the same corporations that actually wanted them to do this stuff back in their home countries too. And so it's all connected, right? Because they're going to get them to process what they need to process in their home countries there, or they're going to come here, get put in through the system, and then have to work and get exploited here at home in this country. It's going to happen either way. Baby.
not so fun fact. That's exactly how Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan ultimately formed the Taliban with a little help from the CIA, who wanted the country's communist government overthrown. This practice was particularly commonplace during the Cold War, as almost every communist government became allied with the USSR. So the USA sought to undermine those allies by backing extremist groups and rebels to destabilize the countries. And in a tale as old as time, that's exactly what went down in Nicaragua. After the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a political party of socialist revolutionaries, overthrew the Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza, they were able to seize control as part of the Junta of National Reconstruction. This was a provisional government that aimed to restore the country post-revolution. Eventually, the Sandinistas forced the more centrist members of the junta out, taking exclusive control in March 1981. This was all largely considered perfectly fine by the US, until it became apparent that the new regime in Nicaragua saw itself as a satellite of Cuba, which had close ties to the Soviet Union. Shortly after, the Contras formed, a group of far-right paramilitary oppositional rebels, and received backing and support from, well, you guessed it, the Central Intelligence Agency.
So, by the way, the Contras, one of the people who is tied to them, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her name. I can't believe I just blanked on her name. I had it in my head. Hang on. Anna Navarro. I had to remember it. Sorry. But Anna Navarro from The View, her parent, I think one of her parents was part of the Contras. This is why she's very anti-socialist, anti-communist, because she's literally raised by Contras. And she speaks of them as if they're, heroes. Meanwhile, oh, jeez.
When Reagan became president following the 1980 election, he began quietly sending aid to the Contras through the CIA to assist them in fighting against the Sandinista government. As part of their Cold War efforts against the Soviet Union, money and weapons were provided to the Contras by the CIA, enabling them to conduct a brutal paramilitary campaign against the Sandinista government. Almost just as sickening was that Ronald Reagan himself described these right-wing extremists as freedom fighters and claimed that cutting off support to the Contras would allow the USSR to influence Central America. This CIA backing of the Contras didn't continue unencumbered, though, as in 1982, Democrats within Congress passed laws that did eventually prevent the support of the rebels in Nicaragua. But of course, this didn't stop the CIA from backing the Contras. It just meant that they were forced to get creative, to really think outside the box for new ways to channel funding to the extremist paramilitary group. And what's a good way to make a lot of money? Cocaine. Now, coke wasn't new to the US at the time, and we aren't talking about the soda. Since the late 70s, there have been record numbers of people snorting cocaine in the United States. Then, when the 80s were in full swing, the latest designer drug hit the market, a smokable variation of cocaine, crack. You might have heard those two terms used interchangeably, but there is actually a difference, the more you know. Most of the cocaine entering the United States was illegally imported from Colombia, but the rise in the use of crack cocaine across American cities became a seemingly instant, infinite money hack for organized crime groups, even those backed by the CIA. You see, as with other countries where the US had covertly assisted in overthrowing newly established governments like Laos, Afghanistan, and Burma, Nicaragua also had a pre-existing trade in narcotics. This had caught the CIA's attention long before their effort to assist the Contras. So it didn't take long for the order to come through from the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Let's smuggle some drugs to get some cash for our operations in Nicaragua. Okay.
And who do you think they sold that to? So that's the basis of why I talk about this. And I'm going to put the link to this video because this video goes on longer. But you guys want to finish watching this, go ahead and I'll put the link in this, right? So this was sold to Black people in our neighborhoods in the United States. Bingo, Jacqueline. Absolutely. This is why we had what we call the crack epidemic. And that epidemic has harmed our families, put hundreds of thousands of especially Black men in prison. This is why the gang activities were so bad in places like New York, New Jersey, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, Oakland. This is why, because what did we need? What did we do? We funded the drug war. Not we, but the United States funded the drug war covertly, which also funded gang wars, which caused a lot of death and destruction within our own communities. So who's to blame for all the drugs that came to our communities? Richard Nixon, Joe Biden, Reagan, Clinton, like all these people, they're the reasons why it is the way it is. And it's bipartisan. It is not limited to one party or another. So when people talk about, oh my God, Reagan was so bad. Also, who are acolytes of Reagan? Reagan was an acolyte of Nixon. And who learned from them? Clinton, Biden, Obama is basically a slightly to the left acolyte of Reagan. Technically, not really. So let me share this story because I wanted to set that up to show that it wasn't just the CIA that was doing it. It was cops. Local law enforcement were also selling and creating crack cocaine. All right, get ready for it, folks, because this one was big one. Florida prosecutor seeks to clear records of people charged with buying police-made crack in the 1980s. Boom. It wasn't just the CIA, baby. This is out of Fort Lauderdale. It says a Florida prosecutor says he will seek to vacate as many 2,600 convictions of people who brought crack cocaine manufactured by the Broward County Sheriff's Office for sting operations between 1988 and 1990. The Florida Supreme Court ruled in 1993 that people couldn't be charged in cases where the sheriff's office made the crack cocaine and undercover deputies then sold it to buyers who were arrested and charged. This Broward County State Attorney Harold F. Pryor said Friday that while his office was reviewing old records, prosecutors realized that many people still have criminal charges or convictions on their records because of the sting operation. It is never too late to do the right thing, Pryor said in a statement. First of all, one of my questions is, the mayor, did he not know about this? And also, my question is, if the mayor did know about this, then the mayor should also be prosecuted for allowing the police department to do this. Because if it's local law enforcement, that means the person that's over local law enforcement should also face criminal charges. I don't care. Look, I don't care if it was the CIA. I don't care if there's plausible deniability, but Reagan, Bush Sr., and hell, I'll even put Clinton in there. They all should face criminal charges as well for what the CIA did, because ultimately they are the top of they're the top of the military. And I count intelligence as part of that. So, yeah. And they're the reasons why our communities were ravaged by this. How many family members have we lost because of either them ODing because of their addiction to this drug, or them being put in incarceration instead of in treatment centers and in hospitals to get over their addiction? And then on top of it, I also blame them for the gang activity that came because of it. I also blame them. I blame the people at the top of our government. I blame them for the proliferation of drugs that were done by the disciples, from the Latin Kings, from the Crips, the Bloods. I blame them for all that. I blame them for all of it. All those young people, especially those young brothers that were gunned down because of turf wars. And why there were turf wars? Because one person was selling on their turf versus the other. That's all it is about. And the thing is like it all came up from our government doing what they were doing, trying to make money to do more covert actions in other countries when it comes to destabilizing so that they can get the resources. So when we say that the foreign policy and domestic policy are all connected, this is what we mean. The foreign policy is connected to the domestic policy that ruin our lives. And when people say, oh, we don't really need to learn about domestic policy. Yes, we do, because it literally feeds into one another. Why the hell you think we were in Afghanistan? It was the opium there. And what did the opium contribute to? Well, the OxyContin, the oxycodone, what the Sackler family was doing here in the United States, contributing to the drugs of the opiate crisis that we have here. That's why. This is why it feeds into one another, right? You don't think that we're not going to have another drug crisis now that what's going on in Syria just happened? Oh, baby. This is why we got to wake up. It's all connected. It goes into one. It shakes hands with one another. Let me continue in this article. Pryor said it's never too late to do the right thing. It is just one example of how the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and early 1990s led to harsh police practices and heavy criminal penalties. Some people may have been convicted of serious felonies because they brought drugs within 1,000 feet, 300 meters of a school. Conviction under that law required that at the time that defendants be sentenced to at least 3 years in prison. That means 3 years ultimately of slave labor. They got a good 3 years of slave labor out of them. Let's continue. It says they were arresting people not for selling, but for purchasing. That's a defense lawyer at Hung. So it says at the time, Hung was a public defender who represented Leon Williams, who appeal led to the state Supreme Court outlawing the practice. They had detention deputies posing as dealers. They would sell it, and these poor people who were addicts were buying it. And they were selling it within 1,000 feet of schools, so penalties would be greater. So ultimately, they were causing an influx on purpose so that they can arrest more people. And remember, private prisons also set up the states so that they had a quota. So the state would have to pay a penalty if the private prisons were below a certain population. If they were, I think it was like below like 90% occupancy. So it actually was because of these private prisons as well that were increasing the amount. Not to mention also the glorification of selling drugs in the streets in order to encourage more people, young people, to do that in order to get more money. So then next thing you know, this is why the rap game changed. This is why you had Diddy talking about, I got money, can't stop, won't stop. Because ultimately it was a game to get us out more into the streets. So then we'll start doing the sales. So then we'll be doing it closer to schools within 1,000 feet. So then when we get in prison, we'll get at least 3 years of conviction. Then we'll be used as slave labor within the system. And the more people you have addicted to a substance, the more demand goes up. The more demand goes up, the more money you make. Capitalism. Let's continue. It's a feedback loop, man. Says they would sell it, and these poor people were addicts were buying it. This is why they don't want to treat drug addiction as a health problem, because if they treat it as a health problem, then it chokes away the money making, which means it chokes away the money making that's used to destabilize governments outside of our country. This is why they want y'all to continue the system in the cycle. This is why they don't want to legalize it. Because if they legalize it or if they decriminalize it, that means that they're not making no more money. That's why the deep state wants the drug war to continue. That's why the deep state does not. This is why the deep state wants to happen. And the deep state is ran by corporations. Everybody thinks it's just some cadre of people within the government. No. The government is a tool. The government is a hammer. Who owns the government is the ones who actually run the government are the corporations. They need that. Because they want the destabilization to happen in these countries. Because the sheriff's office said at the time that it began making crack because it didn't have enough of the seized drug to use in its sting operations. And because it didn't have to later test the cocaine content of crack made by sheriff's office chemist. So if they didn't have enough to seize to do a sting operation, that means that there wasn't as many people doing it. So they contributed to the crisis in order to get more people. Says we find that the law enforcement's conduct here was so outrageous as to violate Florida's due process clause. That was from the Florida Supreme Court. It says Pryor said he notified Broward County Sheriff Gregory Tony that Pryor would ask judges to vacate the convictions. Pryor said Tony supports the plan. Some defendants may also be able to seal or expunge the records, the prosecutor said. They need to be expunged because that's not fair, because they basically, that was entrapment. They entrapped them. Says the review will take a considerable amount of time. Pryor said he and his office will contact people whom may be affected. And you got to remember as well, when you have a record, what that does for you when it comes to employment, when it comes to you getting an apartment or a place to live, that affects every single facet of your life. Your arms are tied for the rest of your life. And so then what do? Because you have those convictions on your record. You could have been locked up for a couple of years 30 years ago, and yet it still shows up on your record. And guess what? It'll show up whenever you try to apply for an apartment or get a loan to start a business, or if you need a job. And so guess what? It also keeps you on a lower rung of society economically. All because they want to do more sting operations. So you had two sets of manipulators. You had the CIA and you had the local police in Broward County that were selling to people in South Florida. And how many more law enforcement officers across this nation were doing the exact same thing? They weren't trying to battle the war on drugs. They were the drug dealers. Now, I will say this. I am of the opinion that I think pretty much all drugs should be legalized. And it should be regulated so that, just like the medications that we have in drugstores are right now. But the issue is that if we were to do that, this would open up for people to be treated medically for drug addiction, just like there is addiction to food, there is addiction to alcohol, right? That's also treated like a medical issue. And if it's treated like a medical issue, then guess what? That chokes the funds that are going to intelligence to destabilize these countries. And it also takes money away from what law enforcement officers make from doing arrests. That means police are not as in the streets as much. That means police actually have to do actual real police work instead of just, knocking the heads of people who are doing opiates. Which means that there's no reason for us to really have to fund the police as much as we do. It also decreases the amount of theft that happens, because if people aren't addicted to these substances, then they won't need to steal for these substances, which also decreases the amount for police, which means that police become more obsolete. This is why we talk about ending the war on drugs, because that's a huge amount of what is going on. This also decreases the need for gang activity, which means that our young ones and our neighborhoods are not going to be pushed because they need to make money because of, crimes of opportunity and crimes of desperation, because of the poverty that's set in our neighborhoods. See, this is why it's so connected. And this is why I say the system needs to change on a fundamental level. This also means rethinking public safety and taking it away from the institutions that were originally slave catchers. This also is a good reason why reparations for American descendants of slavery is also absolutely necessary too, because these are the same people that once we were freed, because we're not completely free, but once we were freed, they were scrambling to get us back in chains. And this is one of the ways that they did it. And white people were caught in the crossfire. Because of the new laws, they had to tag white people and bring y'all into. This is why some of y'all got records too. Because you got addicted to a substance, and then you also had to serve. You didn't serve as much, but you still served, even though it was a health issue. Why? Because they were trying to hit us. They were trying to get us back in chains. And it's absolutely disgusting what this system has done. So this young lady, or this young person, sums it up so nicely. And so this is originally how I learned about this story. So shout out to this young person. And I just appreciate him.
Do y'all remember that time cops in Broward County used taxpayer money to make crack, yes, crack, in the courthouse, and then sold it to unsuspecting buyers just to have them thrown in jail? It sounds like a story straight out of a crime thriller, but it actually happened, and it left behind a trail of convictions that are now under review. Here's what went down. So in the late 1980s, Broward County Sheriff's Office decided that they just didn't have enough crack cocaine to use in undercover stings. So what was their solution? They set up shop on the 7th floor of the Broward County Courthouse in Fort Lauderdale, where they cooked crack. Using $20,000 worth of seized cocaine, they made crack rocks, packaged them individually, and then sold them to people during sting operations. At the time, those who were involved defended the practice, claiming it was efficient for making arrests and saved time on lab tests. Critics, however, called it outrageous and unethical. Defense attorneys were especially vocal, pointing out the moral issues of cops creating and distributing crack. Come on now. The story even shocked federal officials, with some admitting that they had never heard of such practice before. Let's fast forward to today, and the fallout from the scheme is finally being addressed. Broward County State Attorney Harold F. Pryor announced that his office is working to vacate as many as 2,600 convictions tied to these particular operations. Many of these convictions involve people who were not selling drugs but buying small amounts, often within 1,000 feet of schools, which carried harsher penalties. The Florida Supreme Court, though, ruled in 1993 that the actions violated the state's due process clause, declaring it unconstitutional to charge people in cases where the drugs were manufactured and sold by police officers. In layman's terms, it's wrong for police departments to make crack and sell it to people in order to lock them up. Duh. Despite the ruling, some of these convictions remain on people's records decades later, affecting their lives in countless ways. Now, Pryor and his team are combing through old cases to right these wrongs. The process will take some time, but the goal is to essentially undo the damage that was caused by these sting operations and allow these individuals to seal or expunge their records. This story is crazy because it shows us how far the government was willing to go to win the war on drugs. Ways for decades, there's been very little change, just lost lives and heartbreak.
So what do you guys think? What do you think about this story? Because it also perpetuated racism and bigoted thinking as well. Think about the loss of father figures, right? The kids say, the old heads, right? A lot of them were locked up. Think about also being locked up and then having to be subject to the conditions within prison, going through that PTSD, then coming out of prison, never having been treated for that PTSD, never actually been able to heal from being in prison. And then you take whatever has happened to you and you put that also on your community as well. That also is laid on top of us. How do you think that actually affected us? You don't think that the trauma from being locked up also didn't pour on to us as a community? When we say we want reparations for a debt that is owed, I think that the mass incarceration alone is enough to pay us back. Then on top of that, you add things like Jim Crow, which was horrible. We weren't really lynched like that until Jim Crow, until we were freed. And then on top of that, chattel slavery. It is compounded upon compounded upon compounded what we have went through. And it's all because the governments, the corporations didn't want to be undermined by people power. Thank you very much. Go ahead and give a like to the stream. Appreciate it. Let's go into the chats and do our thing and make like a bad ration breakout. All right, we're good on the Rumble side. Looks like we're good there. No rants there. Let's go into the Rockfin. Rockfin. Sorry, I couldn't help it. All right, so, oh Lord, Roger, you making me do homework. Okay. Roger says, James, this story reminds me of the story, Larry Davis story. A brother from the Bronx or Harlem who was selling crack for the NYPD. The NYPD would clear the block and arrest everyone, but leave him be. Why? Because Larry was making money for them. He did it until he decided he didn't want to do it anymore. New York Police Department told him, you stop when we tell you to stop. When his girlfriend at the time had a miscarriage. And it was discovered that it was because of the cocaine she was using. He was like, you're using cocaine or crack. I forgot which one. Then she admitted to him that she was addicted, and one of the cops that he was selling for would come by when he wasn't there and give it to her, as well as give it to her, if you know what I mean. Oh, shit. When that happened, he flipped out and told NYPD, I'm definitely not effing around with y'all no more. And that might have been the warrant put out for his arrest for gun possession. But they was using that as an excuse to off him when they tried to Fred Hampton him, even though he was no Black Panther, although the system portrayed him that way. Oh my gosh. Difference was he fired back shot and injured 6 officers. One of them had to retire because of the injuries. He was like, look, I was in an apartment by myself. My sister and my nieces and nephews were also, and I had to protect them. There was a manhunt out for him. This was what I thought of when the CEO from United Healthcare was killed. I remember Sabrina saying that the only time a manhunt happens like this is when a rich guy gets killed. And I said, no, it's also when their own guys get killed. It mirrored the Larry Davis case so much because of the hood was holding him down. They allowed him to hide out in their apartment projects throughout the city before he moved on to somewhere else. This is why they say snitches get stitches. Got it. That was until her husband came home and saw his wife cooking dinner for Larry after Larry explained the situation to her. The husband was still shook about Larry allowed him to leave and go get some food for the man's kids. Why he didn't send the mother out, I have no idea. But when he was coming back to the elevator, the NYPD who were talking to each other, not him, where they were saying to each other, they know he's in the building. And when he found out they were murdering everybody in the apartment. Wow. That's when the man interrupted the conversation and told them, he's in my apartment. Please don't hurt my kids. I have to be careful what I say. New York Times, November 22nd, 1988, Larry Davis won his second courtroom victory in 9 months yesterday when a Bronx jury acquitted him of attempted murder of 9 police officers in a blazing shootout in 1986. Dang, I was 2. One juror said later that the jury believed Mr. Davis' assertion that he had fired in self-defense after he was shot at. The jury also acquitted Mr. Davis of 6 counts of aggravated assault and the wounding of 6 officers, one whom was hit in the mouth and neck by a bullet and forced to retire. But the jury convicted him of 6 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. Says the NYPD gave a nod to the corrections officers upstate to mess with him because understand legal slavery supported the economy upstate, and why after Kodak, Ford, and all of the manufacturing companies left, they broke his back, but they didn't break him. I direct message you to watch it later, but if you can, put this in the chat and I guess maybe play the first 5 minutes for your audience, it would be good. But like I said, the man was mentioned in old school hip hop lyrics. Some might consider him a rat for working with the government, aka NYPD. Some consider him a vigilante hero growing up against the government NYPD. February 20th, 2008, a correctional officer overseeing the block yard noticed inmates congregating around an argument between 2 inmates. When the officer went to break it up, he found Davis using his walking cane to fend off an inmate for attacking him with a 9-inch long metal shiv. Davis was unsuccessful and was stabbed numerous times. You decide. R.I.P. Larry. Wild story, right? I told Sabrina about it on call and she was like, what? Roger, this is crazy. Imagine her saying that in her high-pitched voice. I'm messing with you. Stop if you hear me. Oh my goodness. 3 minutes of video. The guy who killed him. Was it set up? If so, who was he working for? You decide. Oh my gosh. Wow. That's crazy. Yeah, I don't know if I can play this because I haven't watched it yet. I could, I don't know. I could get in trouble if I play some stuff that might, get me in trouble. So I got to be careful on here. I'm already taking a risk doing this subject, but thank you very much, Roger. I'll put it in the chat though for people. Hang on. Where did I put it? Okay. Yeah, because I don't want to get got. You know what I'm saying? And guys, let me know what you guys think about this subject, this story, because Jacqueline says, I'm pretty sure during the 19th century, the British government was the biggest opium dealer ever. Yeah, I don't blame. I'm not surprised. And Jacqueline says, wonder how much that prison population increased after Clinton and Biden's crime bill. I think it doubled. Yeah, I think it doubled. Yes, thank you very much. Whatever, man. Yeah, Anna Navarro. Her dad was a Contra. Roger says, thanks for making my previous point about how we had no schools of our own. They would actually teach us what you just covered, and did our community just something as recent as what happened in the past 50 years. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think it should be taught not just in our own personal schools, like if we had schools for freedmen, but I think it should be taught in all schools, Did the CIA use Black agents to infiltrate Black communities? I hope that's not an inappropriate question. I don't think it's inappropriate. I think it's actually a really good question. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, if they paid off people, because the thing is, like, when you're living in an area that is depressed by poverty, then people will do stuff for money, out of desperation. They'll even help. They'll think that they're doing good by helping the government, but in reality, they're actually harming your own people. Yeah, they'll do that. This is exactly what happened with the murder of Fred Hampton, when the Chicago police and the FBI killed Fred Hampton. They were paying off informants. So it's no surprise that they would do that, in other cities. They'll do the same thing. They'll always do the same gag twice. Owen Same says, yeah, competition kills. Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you, Terry. Even though my rant was a little scrambled up because my brain isn't working as properly as it should. And yes, Lauren, that's also part of the war on drugs that they continuously do, even though that substance right there is actually much safer than alcohol. But for some reason, that's still on the schedule, but alcohol isn't considered more dangerous, even though it is. Weird, right? Let's continue on. Yeah, I hope the convictions are expunged. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I think a lot of the convictions should be overturned. And then reparations should be given. Because you're literally, locking people up for a health issue. And here's the thing. A lot of times people talk about, well, drug use is a choice. It's like, yeah, but it's a choice that is done when you have been traumatized, right? A lot of times drug use is picked up because of trauma, because people are trying to, heal the pain. They're trying to dull the pain. They're trying to self-medicate in order to be able to walk away from it. And the problem is that's the cheap way of doing it. And the problem is that you have people who experience this trauma consistently because of a system that thrives on exploitation. And that exploitation means that you are in a depressed state economically, which means that you're constantly behind the 8 ball. You're constantly feeling, you're feeling in a fight or flight mode. And so that's how it causes people to behave. Once you have that fight or flight mode, your cortisol levels, jump, which means that your body starts to deteriorate faster, and then it also affects you, in your prefrontal cortex. Your judgment is impaired. As we talked, me and Savvy had talked to Professor Anthony Zinkas, was that poverty literally deteriorates the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for judgment. And so when you subject children to impoverished conditions, then that also, impairs their judgment. And so then this is why sometimes you'll get, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds that are joining, gangs, violent gangs, because they feel like they have no other choice. And then they get stuck into that system because that system is the only means that they have to really survive. And so then because they have that only that means to survive, then, they're doing crimes of desperation and lack of opportunity, because the desperation and lack of opportunity is there on purpose to keep people within that perpetual system until that system comes to bite the rich in the ass, which is what happened to a particular CEO last week. And so this is why I always say that it is better to have an egalitarian and equal and equitable system, because that means that not only is the working people going to survive and thrive and not be harmed, but also the people who are essentially doing the exploitation, they're not exploiting, which means they're not putting their own lives in danger. But yeah, this is why I talk about changing the system from the ground up. So with that being said, I think Hempcar in the chat on Rockman talked about William O'Neill. Dang, have you rewatched this about Korea? I have my guest on already. Not sure what you're talking about, William O'Neill, but good to see you. All right, so I'm heading on out. I am way past my time that I wanted to do, but thank you so very much to everybody for tuning in. Oh, by the way, I talked to Rome last night. He is in good spirits. And we were discussing everything that's happening around the world. So, and Rome, not only was he in good spirits, but he made me laugh. He said he's radicalizing these motherfuckers. So he's doing work even while locked up. So if you guys would like to, of course, we are continuing to assist him with, he has the money for his lawyer, but the money for the commissary as well. So if you guys would like to, you guys can donate to Rome. I'm going to put the link in the chat so you guys can continue to donate for him. You know, I cannot talk about why he's in there, but rest assured, hopefully he will be out and doing work on the ground once again. So thank you so very much for that. Also, just to let you guys know, if any of you are new, I am also just also part of the RBN Orlando chapter. So we are raising money for mutual aid. Hopefully we can do mutual aid within about a month or two. So we're raising as much as we possibly can. If you guys can go $ Orlando RBN on Cash App, that would be greatly appreciated so that we can do more for our neighbors here on the ground. And like I said, like was stated before, the people who, you know, we don't do charity, we do mutual aid, meaning that we are not accepting anything back from the people who we donate to. There is no qualifier for people. It's just we see the people who need help and then we just help and we just give, you know, mutually to other people. So that's what we do for our community. So if you guys would like to, you guys can also donate there. Thank you very much for that. And then also just to let you guys know, I, of course, am on the kidney transplant. I'm trying to get on the kidney transplant list. In fact, I actually went for a testing today. So, but I can also reach out to people who want to see if they qualify to be a donor. Even if you don't donate a kidney to me, you can donate a kidney to somebody. There are over 100,000 people, 109,000 people in the United States that are waiting for organ transplants. Almost 90,000 of them alone are waiting for kidneys. So if you guys would like to, you can go to see if you are a match by going to tgh.org/living kidney donor. So if you guys would like to, you guys can do that as well. Thank you very much to anybody that tries to help either me or anybody else that's waiting for organ transplant, especially like a kidney. It means the most. So thank you very much for that. And in addition to, and furthermore, Roger Meadow says William O'Neill was the informant who set up campus. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. I'm forgetting because I'm getting old, but yeah, thank you very much for that. And then also the readings for the books, The Will to Change by Bell Hooks, Of Water and the Spirit by Melodoma Some, and Presidential by Margaret Kimberly. I will also be continuing the reading of this week. And then be sure to watch Savvy Savs later this evening at 8 p.m. No. 7 p.m. Sorry. Watch her at 7 p.m. And then I think Nick did an interview today, or he's doing an interview tomorrow. But it's going to be good. So be sure to tune in to all of that. And then RBN, we will be doing Savvy and JB show this Thursday. So it's going to be a jam-packed weekend full of news. So with that being said, I think I'm good. I think I'm going to head on out. And I have a meeting in 30 minutes. So water your plants, water yourselves, leave the world better than you found it. Do all the things if you got them. And look, talk to your friends about what's going on in the world, and always link it back between foreign and domestic policy. Let people know that it's all connected and connected to the system. It's not necessarily an individual issue. It's not an individual failing. It's a systemic failing. And express solidarity and love to your fellow human beings. Kindness goes a long way. Okay? I love you guys for watching. Mwah, forehead kisses. I'll see you guys in the next one. Ciao. Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Jaybefaunt. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah. Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.